Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing some huge news coming out of the San Jose Sharks organization today, and that is that Doug Wilson has decided to step down as general manager of the San Jose Sharks, and Joe Will, who had already been filling in for him over these past few months, is going to be taking over fully the role as interim general manager until, a further decision comes down the line of what to do with this particular spot on the team. And this isn't necessarily that much of a surprise. Like I mentioned, Joe Will had already been filling in for Doug Wilson over these past few months, because back earlier on in the season, Doug Wilson had been forced to step aside due to medical reasons. And while maybe at first people were only expecting that to last a couple weeks, maybe a month or two, it has ended up being pretty much the entirety of the season. And Joe Will had already been making many of the major decisions, and while of course he's mentioned that he has been consulting with Doug Wilson along the way, I suspect Joe Will has been the one having the final say, and considering the massive decision that was signing that Tomas Hertl contract, he had already been doing a job, that particular job, for most of this season, so it's really not that much of a surprise. And I do know there is also a not insignificant contingent of Sharks fans who were hoping for Doug Wilson to get fired by the end of this season. In fact, many were hoping that he had been fired the beginning of this year, the beginning of last year. Generally, it feels as though people have been saying, or some people have been saying, fire Doug Wilson for many years at this point. And I don't know if that's a combination of recency bias or just generally the fact that those fans are maybe newer fans and so have really only been watching the Sharks kind of struggle over these past 3 seasons. But Doug Wilson historically has had a lot of success with the San Jose Sharks. Yes, it is of course true that the elusive Stanley Cup have never made its way back to San Jose. Well, I can't even say back to San Jose. It has never made its way to San Jose for a first time ever. However, the Sharks were still an extremely competitive team, which is very fun to watch, and one of the best teams in the league over his tenure. He managed to get the Sharks to the playoffs 15 seasons, almost in a row, only interrupted by the 2014-2015 season. The Sharks made it to the Western Conference Finals 5 times, despite the fact that the Sharks have been widely regarded. They have this sort of narrative that's a very strange narrative as chokers. They've managed to make it to the finals, or the Western Conference Finals, 5 different times, and pretty recently as well, the 2019 season, the 2016 season, and of course in that 2016 season, they even managed to make it to the Stanley Cup Finals. There are at least a dozen, maybe even a couple of dozen teams that would kill to have the success that the Sharks had during Doug Wilson's tenure. He made some marvelous trades during his time as well. I mean, the biggest one was acquiring Joe Thornton from the Boston Bruins all the way back within just the first couple of years with the San Jose Sharks, which basically changed the entire landscape of the franchise for many years to come, as we now know. He also made the very important Brent Burns trade near the start of last decade, and he has obviously been a massive part of the Sharks franchise since then, and generally he has made a lot of positive moves. Yes, there have been some negative moves. A lot of people will point to the Erik Karlsson trade, as well as the signing of Erik Karlsson, the Vlasic extension, the Burns extension, things like this, but I feel as though most often the positives kind of outweigh the negatives, and even though the Sharks have struggled over these past 3 seasons and I don't necessarily enjoy the direction that the team has been taken in, I feel as though Doug Wilson definitely has earned a lot of credit still, and also shouldn't be the one taking the majority of the blame for the situation. Because I think that's a very important thing to mention. A lot of people might now be thinking, oh, with Doug Wilson gone, the Sharks are going to go the way like the Anaheim Ducks did when they replaced their previous general manager. They bring in a new guy. The new guy decides to go full on for the rebuild. He trades away Rickard Rakell, a couple other players, Josh Manson, things like that, going full draft pick, and they're hoping to be competitive in a couple of seasons. Well, it should be noted, I would suspect, considering the financial situation of the San Jose Sharks, that it is very, very likely that Hasso Plattner, the owner of the Sharks, has been playing a pretty significant role in the running of the team, and that Doug Wilson didn't necessarily have the freedom to make moves to try and get this team, into a rebuild and potentially sacrifice a lot of money over these next few seasons trying to do that and just missing the playoffs every single year. On top of that, the biggest decision that would have come down to either rebuilding or trying to go for it was that Tomas Hertl contract that is now too little too late. You have signed that, making it that much more difficult to try and go for a rebuild. So when it comes to actual potential replacements for Doug Wilson, there are, I would say, 3 different options. The first one would just be retaining Joe Will. He has been with the team for a while now, and he has been doing a decent job at being a general manager thus far this season, so in the trouble of saving the search, you could just go with him. The second option would just be going with a classic sort of veteran, experienced general manager, a guy who has been around the block multiple times already. You bring him in, he tries to keep the team competitive, and you see where that goes. Maybe it works out, maybe it doesn't, who knows, but it's a very safe option as well. The third, and something that many people would like to see, is that the Sharks go completely off the board. They pick up a general manager like a Kyle Dubas that the Toronto Maple Leafs picked up a few years ago. They go maybe a bit younger, a bit more inexperienced. The problem I see with that, like I said, is that the Sharks probably aren't going to be able to go for some sort of rebuild no matter the general manager that they hire. And even if they were to hire this inexperienced young guy with a lot of hunger to try and make a team better, the fact of the matter is, I feel as though he'd end up under the thumb of Hasso Plattner and probably would still just be an inexperienced guy who's trying to go for it and trying to make this team competitive. Maybe that's still the way to go. Maybe that guy ends up skewing more towards the analytics side, and that helps the San Jose Sharks succeed into the future. But the fact is, I know there were a lot of people saying that they wanted to fire Doug Wilson. They then wanted to try and rebuild this team. I suspect that that's not going to happen, even with this move by Wilson to step down. And so while this is obviously huge news, I find that the daily, day-to-day direction of this team is probably not going to change that much. Class dismissed.